You were never meant to be nothing." The words hit Kira like a physical blow, cutting through the silence of Oracle Marjorie's candlelit chamber. She had come seeking answers about the strange dreams, the whispers in her sleep, the way shadows seemed to bend toward her lately. She had not come to have her entire world shattered. Kira felt the words settle into her bones, heavy and impossible. Oracle Marjorie sat across from her, ancient eyes gleaming with secrets that had been buried for decades. The old woman's gnarled hands traced symbols in the dust on her wooden table, symbols that glowed faintly silver in the dim light. "I don't understand," Kira whispered. Her voice sounded small in the cramped space, smaller than she felt most days. "I am nothing. Everyone knows that. I can't even shift properly. I have no wolf. "You have no wolf because she was bound." Marjorie's voice cut through her protests like a blade. "Bound by magic so old and dark that even I struggle to see its origins. But I can see what lies beneath the binding, child. I can see what you truly are." The air in the chamber grew thick, charged with something that made Kira's skin prickle. Marjorie rose from her chair and moved to an ancient chest in the corner, her movements deliberate despite her age. When she returned, she carried a mirror unlike any Kira had ever seen. Its surface was polished obsidian, and silver veins ran through it like captured lightning. "Look," Marjorie commanded, holding the mirror before Kira's face. "Look with your true sight." Kira stared into the dark surface, expecting to see her own unremarkable reflection staring back. Instead, she saw a stranger. The face was hers, but silver light emanated from her eyes, and her dark hair seemed to move with its own wind. Most shocking of all, a crescent moon glowed on her forehead, bright as starlight against her skin. "The bloodline of the Moon Empress," Marjorie breathed. "I should have seen it sooner, the way you move through shadows unseen, the way injured animals seek you out, the way the moon calls to you even when you cannot answer. You are not broken, child, you are hidden." Kira's hands trembled as she reached toward the mirror, but her reflection showed no silver light, no glowing mark, just her ordinary face, pale with shock. "This isn't real. It can't be real. The Moon Empress line died out centuries ago. Everyone knows that." "Everyone knows what they were told to know." Marjorie set the mirror aside and fixed Kira with a stare that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Your mother brought you to me when you were barely 3 days old. She begged me to hide you, to bind your wolf, to make you invisible to those who would hunt you. The spell was meant to break when you turned 18, but something went wrong. The binding held." The revelation hit Kira like drowning, like being pulled under by currents too strong to fight. Memories surfaced unbidden. Her mother's haunted eyes, the way strangers sometimes stared at her with recognition before quickly looking away. The dreams of silver light and ancient voices calling her name. "Who would hunt me?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer would terrify her. "The Shadow Court." Marjorie's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "They have been systematically destroying every bloodline that carries Moon Empress heritage. You are the last, Kira, the very last." As if summoned by the oracle's words, something stirred deep within Kira's chest. A presence she had never felt before, ancient and powerful and achingly familiar. Her wolf, still bound, still trapped, but suddenly desperately trying to surface. The sensation was overwhelming. Kira gasped and pressed her hands to her chest, feeling as though something vital was trying to claw its way out from beneath her ribs. The wolf's consciousness brushed against hers, and for one impossible moment she felt complete. Then the feeling vanished, leaving her hollow and bereft. "She knows you now," Marjorie said softly. "The binding weakens as the truth comes to light, but you are in terrible danger, child. If I can sense your awakening, so can they. They will come for you, and soon." Kira struggled to breathe, to think, to process what she was being told. Her entire life had been built on the foundation of her worthlessness, her failure to be what the pack needed. Now that foundation was crumbling, and she did not know what would be left when the dust settled. "What am I supposed to do?" The question came out broken, desperate. Marjorie reached across the table and grasped Kira's hands. Her touch was warm, grounding. "You learn who you truly are, you find your power, and you prepare to fight for the right to exist." She squeezed Kira's fingers. "The Moon Empress was never meant to be conquered, child. She was meant to conquer." Outside the oracle's chamber, storm clouds gathered despite the clear morning sky, and somewhere in the distance something howled. Not with the voice of any natural wolf, but with the sound of ancient hunger finally catching a scent it had been tracking for far too long. Kira felt it in her bones, that howl. A call and a threat and a promise all at once. The hunt had begun. The moment Kira's transformation completed, the world changed. Silver light erupted from her form with such intensity that it turned night to day across 3 territories, and every supernatural creature within 100 miles felt the cosmic shift as the last Moon Empress heir claimed her full inheritance. She rose from the rebuilt altar, no longer entirely mortal, her physical form now a perfect vessel for power that had been building toward this moment for over 3 centuries. The Shadow Court entities recoiled from the radiance pouring off her like living flame, but their retreat lasted only seconds. As the eclipse reached its absolute peak, they too achieved their maximum manifestation, becoming creatures of such dense darkness that they seemed to devour light itself simply by existing. "You think your little awakening changes anything?" Isabella snarled, her corrupted form now stabilizing into something that hurt to look at directly. "We are eternal, we are—" "Afraid," Kira finished, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated across dimensions. "I can see it now, the terror that drives your hunger. You're afraid that if you stop consuming, stop dominating, stop hurting others, you'll fade away entirely." With her fully awakened senses, she could perceive the Shadow Court's true nature in ways that had been impossible before. They weren't beings of pure evil, but entities so damaged by isolation that they could only feel alive when causing pain. Their exile had created a feedback loop of suffering that had lasted centuries. The largest of the entities stepped forward, its form shifting between nightmare shapes with each movement. Unlike Isabella's vessel, this was one of the original Shadow Court members, a being that had existed since before the first Moon Empress walked the earth. "You understand nothing, child," it rumbled, its voice like the death of stars. "We were cast out not for our crimes, but for our refusal to submit. We chose freedom over servitude, independence over the chains your ancestors called natural order." Kira felt the truth in its words, and the revelation staggered her. The Shadow Court hadn't been banished for being evil. They had been exiled for refusing to accept their place in the cosmic hierarchy that kept the supernatural world stable. "They were rebels," she whispered, understanding flooding through her awakened consciousness. "The first rebels against divine authority. And now you offer us the same chains wrapped in prettier words," the ancient entity continued. "Connection, purpose, belonging, all illusions designed to make slavery palatable." The philosophical weight of what she faced crashed over Kira like a tide. How could she condemn beings to imprisonment for wanting the same freedom she had claimed for herself? How could she force them to accept a place in an order they fundamentally rejected? But through the mate bond, she felt Damon's unwavering support, his absolute trust in her wisdom. And through the pack bonds that now connected her to wolves across multiple territories, she felt the lives depending on her choice. Millions of creatures who had done nothing wrong except exist in the path of the Shadow Court's rebellion. "You're right," she said, her admission stunning the entities into momentary silence. "The original binding was unjust. You were punished for refusing to submit, not for any actual evil." Isabella's vessel form wavered with confusion. This wasn't how the confrontation was supposed to unfold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I won't repeat my ancestors' mistake." Kira stepped forward, her silver radiance meeting the creature's darkness without flinching. "I won't force you to accept chains you don't want, but I also won't let you destroy innocence to prove your freedom." The ancient entity's form stilled, studying her with interest that felt dangerous. "Then what do you propose, little Empress?" Kira reached deep into her awakened power, touching cosmic forces that existed beyond the physical realm. With her enhanced perception, she could see the fundamental structure of reality itself, the way dimensions connected and separated, the spaces between worlds where different rules applied. "A realm of your own," she said, the solution crystallizing as she spoke. "Not a prison, but a sovereign domain where you can exist according to your own nature without threatening others. A place where your rebellion has meaning because you chose it freely." The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with implications none of them had considered before. The Shadow Court entities exchanged glances, their forms flickering with something that might have been hope. "And if we refuse?" Isabella demanded. "If we choose to stay and fight?" Kira's expression hardened, and for the first time the entities saw not compassion, but the implacable will that had made the Moon Empress bloodline legendary. "Then I create a prison so absolute that your current exile will seem like paradise, and I craft it with such precision that you'll never threaten anyone again." The power flowing through her made the threat more than credible. She had access to forces that could reshape reality, could create or destroy entire dimensions with focused will. The Shadow Court had gambled everything on this moment, and they had lost. The ancient entity considered her offer for what felt like eternities, but was probably only seconds. Around them, the eclipse held at totality, as if the cosmos itself was waiting for this decision. "Show us," it finally said. "Show us this realm you would create." Kira nodded and reached into the space between dimensions, her power flowing like silver fire as she began to craft something that had never existed before. Not a prison designed to contain, but a world designed to liberate. A realm where beings could rebel against natural order without harming others, where their refusal to submit became a form of creative force rather than destructive hunger. The other Shadow Court entities watched in growing wonder as the new dimension took shape, its laws and structures reflecting their nature while providing outlets for their need to reject authority. It was beautiful in its alien way, a realm of controlled chaos where their eternal rebellion could finally have meaning. "It's perfect," one of them whispered, its form already beginning to fade as it prepared to cross into the new domain. But Isabella's vessel rejected the offer with shrieking fury. "No! We came here to destroy, to consume, to make them pay for what was done to us. I won't be bought off with pretty words and cosmic real estate." She launched herself at Kira with every ounce of corrupted power she possessed, her form becoming a lance of pure malevolence aimed at the heart of everything Kira had tried to build. Kira met the attack with moonlight forged into solid protection, and where Isabella's darkness struck her defences, the impact shattered dimensional barriers for miles around. But the attack failed, Isabella's hatred unable to overcome power fueled by love and tempered by justice. "Then you choose binding," Kira said sadly, her silver fire wrapping around Isabella's form like chains of starlight. "And you choose it alone." The corrupted vessel was pulled into a prison dimension crafted specifically for her, one that would contain her rage until she learned to let it go. The other Shadow Court entities watched her disappear, then turned back to Kira with something approaching respect. "The realm you offer," the ancient entity said. "There are no strings attached, no hidden obligations." "None," Kira confirmed. "Your sovereignty is absolute within its borders. The only requirement is that you stay there willingly." One by one, the Shadow Court entities began crossing into their new domain, their forms growing lighter as they shed centuries of accumulated hatred and hunger. They were still rebels, still creatures who would never submit to authority, but now their rebellion had a purpose beyond destruction. As the last of them disappeared into the realm she had crafted, Kira felt the eclipse beginning to wane. The cosmic alignment that had made this moment possible was ending, but the changes it had wrought were permanent. She had done what generations of moon empresses before her had failed to achieve. She had found a solution that honoured both justice and mercy, that protected the innocent without perpetuating injustice. The world was safe, but more importantly, it was better than it had been before. The binding ritual that Kira began as the eclipse waned was unlike anything attempted in the history of the supernatural world. Instead of the brutal imprisonment her ancestors had crafted, she wove something entirely new, a connection that would preserve the Shadow Court's sovereignty while ensuring they could never again threaten innocent lives. Standing in the centre of the rebuilt shrine, she drew power from sources no previous Moon Empress had been able to access. The pack bonds that connected her to wolves across multiple territories, the mate bond that anchored her to Damon's unwavering love, and most importantly, the willing cooperation of the Shadow Court entities themselves. "This requires sacrifice," she explained to the ancient beings who had chosen to help rather than flee to their new realm. "I must give up a portion of my own power permanently to create bonds strong enough to hold across dimensions." The entity that had spoken for the Shadow Court flickered with something that might have been concern. "You would weaken yourself to protect those who have shown you nothing but cruelty?" Kira smiled, her silver radiance pulsing with determination. "I would ensure that future generations never have to face what we've faced. That's what power is for." The ritual itself was breathtakingly complex, requiring her to simultaneously exist in multiple dimensions while weaving energy patterns that would endure for millennia. She felt her cosmic strength flowing away like water through cupped hands, each thread of the new binding costing her abilities that would never return. But as her power diminished, something else grew stronger. The connections between herself and every living thing in her territory became more profound, more nuanced. She was trading raw force for deep understanding, cosmic might for perfect empathy. Through the mate bond, she felt Damon's support flowing into her, his absolute faith in her choices, giving her strength to continue even as the effort pushed her beyond normal endurance. Through the pack bonds, she felt the wolves who had chosen to follow her, sending their own energy to fuel the ritual. "We are with you," they whispered across the psychic link, "always." The new binding took shape like a living thing, beautiful and complex and utterly unprecedented. Instead of chains designed to cause suffering, she crafted connections that would allow the Shadow Court entities to feel the joy and pain of the lives they might affect. If they chose to cause harm, they would experience that harm themselves. If they chose to create beauty, they would share in the resulting happiness. "Erlad's empathy as enforcement," breathed one of the entities. "Brilliant and terrible." "Not enforcement," Kira corrected gently. "Education. You'll finally understand what it feels like to be on the receiving end of your choices." As the binding neared completion, Isabella's prison dimension began to crack. The corrupted vessel had been fighting her confinement with such fury that the temporary prison Kira had crafted was beginning to fail. "Let her out," Kira said, surprising everyone present. "Are you insane?" Damon demanded. "She'll try to kill you the moment she's free." "She'll try," Kira agreed, "but she needs to face the same choice as the others, redemption or permanent exile. I won't make that decision for her." The prison dimension dissolved, and Isabella emerged in a form that was barely recognizable as the pack member she had once been. Shadow Court corruption had twisted her beyond most mortal limits, turning her into something that existed at the intersection of nightmare and rage. "You think your pathetic mercy means anything?" Isabella snarled, her multiple voices creating discordant harmonies. "I will tear this world apart piece by piece, and I'll start with everyone you've ever cared about." She launched herself at Damon, correctly identifying him as Kira's greatest weakness. But the attack never landed. The partial binding Kira had already completed meant that Isabella felt every ounce of murderous intent she projected, experienced firsthand the terror and pain she was trying to inflict. The corrupted vessel staggered, her form flickering as she struggled to process emotions she had spent years suppressing. What is this? Consequence, Kira said softly. For the first time in decades, you're feeling what your victims feel. Every moment of fear, every second of agony, every heartbreak you've caused. Isabella screamed, but the sound held notes of anguish that went beyond physical pain. She was experiencing remorse for the first time since her corruption began, and the weight of accumulated guilt was overwhelming. "Make it stop," she begged, her multiple forms beginning to separate as Shadow Court influence warred with returning humanity. "Please, make it stop." "I can't," Kira replied, her heart breaking for the creature Isabella had become. "But you can. Choose differently. Choose to heal instead of harm, to build instead of destroy. The binding will respond to your intentions." For a moment it seemed like Isabella might find her way back to something resembling redemption. Her form solidified into something more recognizably human, and her eyes held a clarity that had been absent for years. But then the Shadow Court corruption that had claimed her so completely reasserted itself. "No," she whispered, her voice full of bitter certainty. "I've gone too far, done too much. There's no coming back from what I've become." She turned that clarity on Kira, and for the first time her expression held genuine remorse. "I'm sorry, for all of it, but I can't. I can't live with what I've done, and I can't trust myself not to do it again." Before anyone could stop her, Isabella stepped backward into the dimensional rift that led to the new Shadow Court realm. But instead of seeking sanctuary there, she kept moving, walking deliberately toward the void spaces between dimensions where even cosmic entities couldn't survive. "Isabella, no!" Kira reached toward her, but the corrupted vessel shook her head. "This is my choice," Isabella said, her form already beginning to fade. "The first real choice I've made in years. Let me have this one thing." She dissolved into the space between worlds, her consciousness scattering across dimensional barriers until nothing remained. It wasn't redemption exactly, but it was acknowledgement, recognition of harm done and responsibility taken. The binding ritual completed itself in the wake of Isabella's sacrifice, the new connection settling into place with a harmony that sang across multiple dimensions. The Shadow Court entities who had chosen to participate found themselves linked to the emotional fabric of reality itself. Their isolation finally ended through bonds of empathy rather than chains of oppression. "It's beautiful," one of them whispered, experiencing connection for the first time in centuries. "We can feel everything, the joy, the sorrow, the love. How did we survive so long without this?" Kira smiled, though the effort had left her exhausted beyond measure. "You were surviving. Now you can live." As the last echoes of the eclipse faded and normal sunlight returned to the world, she felt the permanent changes settling into place. The Shadow Court threat was ended, not through destruction, but through transformation. The ancient cycle of imprisonment and escape had been broken, replaced by something unprecedented in cosmic history. Damon caught her as she swayed, her strength finally giving out after holding the ritual together through will alone. Through their bond, she felt his amazement at what she had accomplished, his pride in the mercy she had shown even to enemies. "Is it over?" he asked quietly. Kira looked around at the transformed world, at the Shadow Court entities learning to experience empathy, at the pack bonds that now connected species across dimensional boundaries, at the shrine that had been rebuilt stronger and more beautiful than ever before. "The war is over," she confirmed. "Now we get to find out what peace looks like." The age of the Moon Empress had begun, and it would be an age of connection rather than conquest, understanding rather than domination. The world had been saved by choosing love over fear, redemption over revenge, wisdom over power, And for the first time in centuries, the future held hope instead of inevitability. 3 months after the eclipse, Kira stood on the balcony of what had once been the Pack Compound's main hall, now transformed into something that resembled a palace more than a fortress. The changes weren't just architectural. Everything about their world had shifted to accommodate the presence of a true moon empress, and the adjustment had been surprisingly smooth. "The Northern Territories have officially requested alliance," Damon said, joining her at the stone railing. In his hands, he carried the latest reports from scouts and diplomats who had once been simple pack warriors. "They want protection under the new binding network." Kira smiled, feeling the truth of his words through the expanded consciousness that was her constant companion now. Across hundreds of miles, she could sense the wolves who had chosen to join their growing coalition, all of them connected through bonds that had nothing to do with domination and everything to do with mutual support. The mating ceremony they had held 2 weeks after the Shadow Court resolution had been unlike anything in recorded pack history. Representatives from 17 different territories had come to witness the union of Alpha and Empress, and the celebration had lasted for 3 days. But more meaningful than the public spectacle had been the quiet moment afterward, when Damon had held her close and whispered that he loved not just her power, but the person she had chosen to become. "Isabella's followers?" she asked, though she already knew the answer through her enhanced awareness. "Most have accepted the amnesty terms," Damon confirmed. "Rehabilitation through community service, supervised by wolves whose loyalty was never in question. Marcus thinks they'll make useful additions to the rebuilding efforts once they've proven their commitment to the new order." Kira nodded, unsurprised. The binding network she had created made deception nearly impossible among those connected to it. Former enemies couldn't hide hostile intentions any more than she could hide her determination to protect everyone under her care. Through the mate bond, she felt Damon's quiet amazement at how naturally she had grown into her role. The girl who had once scrubbed floors and endured mockery now held regular audiences with supernatural creatures from across the continent, settling disputes and offering guidance with wisdom that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her own experience. "There's something else," Damon said, his voice carrying a note of wonder that made her turn to face him fully. She already knew, of course, had known for weeks through the subtle changes in her body, the new presence she carried within her that pulsed with life and potential. But hearing him say it would make it real in ways that private knowledge couldn't. "We're having a child," he whispered, his hands moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "The bloodline continues." Kira placed her hands over his, feeling the tiny spark of consciousness that would grow into the next generation of royal power. "She'll never know what it feels like to be worthless," she said with fierce certainty. "She'll grow up knowing exactly how much she matters." The sun was setting over their territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of the eclipse that had changed everything. But this light was warm instead of ominous, promising rather than threatening. "Do you ever regret it?" Damon asked quietly. "Giving up so much power to create the binding network?" Kira considered the question seriously. She was still immensely powerful, still capable of feats that awed even ancient supernatural beings. But she was no longer the cosmic force she had been during the eclipse, no longer able to reshape reality with focused will. "I traded power over others for power with others," she said finally. "That's not a loss, that's evolution." Below them, the compound bustled with activity as wolves who had once been enemies worked together on construction projects and trade negotiations. Children played in gardens where shadow creatures had once hunted, their laughter carrying on evening breezes that tasted of hope instead of fear. "I love you," Damon said, the words carrying all the weight of everything they had survived together. "I love you too," Kira replied, feeling the truth of it resonate through every bond that connected her to the life she had built. When she had been nothing, she had dreamed of becoming something. Now that she was everything, she had learned that the most important thing was who you chose to become it with. The poison tasted like bitter almonds and death. Kira dropped the wooden spoon before the first bite reached her lips, her newly awakened instincts screaming danger in a voice she was only beginning to understand. The porridge splattered across the kitchen floor, steam rising from where it ate through the stone. "Smart girl," muttered cook Eleanor, though her weathered face showed more worry than praise. "That's the third attempt this week. Someone wants you dead real bad." Kira stared at the smoking mess, her hands shaking. 3 days had passed since Oracle Marjorie's revelation. 3 days of looking over her shoulder and jumping at shadows. She had hoped the attempts on her life were coincidence, accidents, perhaps even her paranoia running wild. The evidence dissolving the floorstones suggested otherwise. "Who delivered the grain this morning?" Kira asked, though she suspected she already knew. Isabella's personal servant. Said the Alpha King's intended, wanted to ensure you were properly fed." Eleanor's voice dripped with disgust, as if that viper cares whether you live or starve. Before Kira could respond, the kitchen windows exploded inward in a shower of glass and shadow. Creatures poured through the openings, beings that hurt to look at directly, their forms shifting between solid darkness and empty void. They moved wrong, too fast and too fluid, like nightmares given flesh. Kira's world slowed. She could see through them somehow, see the malevolent intelligence burning in their core, see the magical tethers that bound them to a distant master. Her vision had changed since the Oracle's mirror, showing her layers of reality she had never perceived before. "Run!" Elena screamed, but Kira was already moving. She sprinted from the kitchen as the shadow creatures flowed after her, their forms barely constrained by the physical walls. They whispered as they hunted, voices like grinding bones and dying hope, speaking words in a language that predated human speech. The corridor stretched endlessly before her, familiar passages now transformed into a maze of terror. Every shadow could hide death, every doorway could conceal an ambush, but her new sight guided her, showing her which paths were clear and which teemed with unseen danger. She burst through the rear entrance and into the moonlit courtyard, her lungs burning. Behind her, she could hear Elena screaming, the sound cutting off abruptly in a way that made Kira's heart clench with guilt and rage. The shadow creatures emerged from the building like smoke pouring from a fire, their forms more solid in the darkness, more terrible. They surrounded her in seconds, cutting off every avenue of escape except one. The whispering woods. Even pack wolves avoided the ancient forest that bordered their territory. Stories told of travellers who entered and were never seen again, of voices that called from between the trees, of magic older and wilder than anything their kind understood. But as the shadow creatures closed in, Kira realized she had no choice. She ran for the tree line. The moment her feet touched the forest floor, everything changed. The oppressive weight of magical threat lifted, replaced by something else entirely. The woods welcomed her, ancient oaks bending their branches to guide her path, root systems shifting to smooth her way. She could feel the forest's awareness, vast and patient and protective. Behind her, the shadow creatures shrieked in frustration and fury. They could not follow her here. Something in this place held them at bay, some power that recognized her right to sanctuary. Kira stumbled deeper into the woods, guided by instincts she did not understand. The trees seemed to part before her, revealing a path that glowed faintly silver in the moonlight. She followed it without question, her body moving with confidence her mind did not share. The path led to a clearing where moonlight pooled like liquid silver around an ancient stone structure. It was barely more than ruins now, worn columns and crumbling walls covered in moss and vines. But carved symbols still glowed faintly on every surface, and the crescent moon shape of the central altar was unmistakable. A shrine to the Moon Empress. Kira approached slowly, drawn by forces beyond her control. The moment her fingers touched the central altar stone, the world exploded into memory and light. She saw herself as a child, playing in this very clearing, while a woman with silver hair and kind eyes watched from the shadows. She saw the binding ritual, dark magic wrapping around her infant form like chains. She saw her mother's tears as she handed over her daughter to strangers who promised to keep her safe. "You have returned." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, ancient as the stones themselves. "The daughter of the moon comes home at last." Kira spun around, but the clearing was empty save for the ruins and the silver light. Yet she could feel a presence watching her, something vast and eternal and impossibly familiar. "Who are you?" she whispered. "I am the first, the one who bound the shadows and walked between worlds. I am the voice that calls your blood home." The presence moved closer, not physically, but in ways that bypassed the physical entirely. "You carry my legacy, child. My power sleeps in your bones." The shadow creatures had found the forest edge. Their howls of rage and hunger echoed through the trees, a sound like the death of hope itself. But they came no closer, held back by wards older than memory. "They will never stop hunting you," the voice continued, "not while you draw breath. The Shadow Court remembers what we did to them, and they will have their revenge through your blood." Kira pressed her hands to the altar, feeling power flow through the ancient stone and into her bones. Her bound wolf stirred again, pushing against the magical chains that held her spirit prisoner. "Then help me," she said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "Help me become what I'm supposed to be." The presence seemed to smile, though she could not see it. "The trials begin at dawn, daughter of my line. Prove yourself worthy, and I will teach you to be more than they ever dreamed you could become." As if in response to her ancestors' words, the first light of sunrise touched the eastern sky. And in that light, Kira thought she saw the shadow creatures retreating, slinking back to whatever darkness had spawned them. But she knew they would return. They would always return until she found the strength to make them stop. Dawn broke over the shrine with the weight of destiny, and Kira felt the ancient stones respond to the first rays of sunlight like a living thing awakening. The moonstones embedded in the altar began to pulse with silver light, their rhythm matching her heartbeat. She had spent the night in restless vigil, feeling the ancestral presence watching her, judging her readiness for what was to come. "Place your hands upon the altar, daughter of my line." The voice of the first moon empress echoed from the stones themselves. "Let the trials judge your heart." Kira pressed her palms against the cool stone surface, and the world exploded into blinding silver light. When her vision cleared, she stood in a place that was not quite real, where shadows moved with their own will, and the sky shifted between day and night with each breath. The first trial materialized around her like a waking nightmare. She stood in the packed compound's great hall, but it was wrong, twisted. Every face turned toward her belonged to someone who had called her worthless, who had treated her like less than nothing. Their voices rose in a chorus of condemnation, each word a blade designed to cut her spirit to pieces. "You think you deserve power?" Alpha Marcus sneered, his form larger and more menacing than life. "You couldn't even shift properly. You're broken, worthless, a mistake that should never have been born." The words hit her like physical blows, each one finding the scars left by years of believing she was nothing. But something had changed in the days since Oracle Marjorie's revelation. The certainty of her worthlessness had cracked, and through those cracks, something fiercer was beginning to emerge. "I was never broken," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I was hidden." The nightmare versions of her tormentors laughed, but their forms began to waver, losing substance as her conviction grew stronger. One by one, they faded until only she remained, standing in silver light that poured from her own skin. The second trial came without warning. she found herself in a meadow filled with wounded creatures, their cries of pain cutting through her heart like knives. A deer with a shattered leg, a wolf pup abandoned and starving, a great eagle with broken wings. All of them looked at her with eyes that held too much intelligence, too much hope. "Heal them," whispered the ancestral voice. "Show me you understand what true power is meant for." Kira knelt beside the deer, her hands shaking as she reached toward the wounded animal. She had no training, no knowledge of healing magic, only the desperate desire to ease its suffering. Silver light began to flow from her fingers, warm and soothing, and she watched in wonder as the broken bone knitted itself together. But as she moved from creature to creature, something else intruded on her concentration. Pain, sharp and sudden, lancing through her chest like a spear thrust. Not her pain, his pain, Damon. The mate bond that had been a whisper for so long suddenly roared to life, flooding her with sensations that belonged to someone else. She felt his exhaustion, his wounds, the weight of command pressing down on him like a physical burden. He was fighting, somewhere far away, and every blow he took echoed through their connection. Her hands faltered on the eagle's wing as another wave of shared agony crashed over her. Through the bond, she felt Damon's sword arm trembling with fatigue, felt blood running down his side from a wound he couldn't tend while still in battle. "Focus, daughter!" The ancestral presence pressed closer, its voice urgent. "You cannot help him by failing here." Kira gritted her teeth and poured her will into the healing light, using the pain flowing through the bond as fuel for her compassion. Each creature she healed seemed to ease some small part of Damon's suffering, as if the magic was connecting them all in ways she didn't understand. The third trial was the cruelest. She stood before a gathering of ancient spirits, beings of pure light and shadow that had existed since the world was young. They watched her with eyes like stars, their judgment weighing on her spirit like the pressure of deep water. "Command us," they said in unison, their voices like the whisper of wind through eternity. "Prove you are worthy to lead those who cannot be compelled, only inspired." Kira stared at them, feeling utterly inadequate. How could she command beings that had witnessed the birth of mountains, that had seen empires rise and fall like waves on a shore? She was nobody, nothing, a girl who had scrubbed floors and endured mockery for most of her life. But then another surge of pain from the mate bond nearly drove her to her knees, and she felt something inside her break free entirely. Not just acceptance of her heritage, but fierce, protective love for the man fighting so far away. "I don't command you," she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "I ask you to stand with me, to help me protect those who cannot protect themselves, to choose hope over fear, creation over destruction." She met each spirit's gaze in turn. "I offer you purpose, not servitude, partnership, not dominion." The spirits exchanged glances that somehow conveyed eons of silent communication. Then, one by one, they bowed their heads in acknowledgement. "You understand," they whispered. "True power serves, it does not seek to be served." The trials dissolved around her, returning her to the shrine at dawn. But she was no longer the same person who had placed her hands on the altar. Power flowed through her veins like liquid starlight, and memories that were not her own filled her mind. The wisdom of the moon empresses who had come before, their triumphs and failures, their loves and losses. She knew how to call light from darkness now, how to speak with the voices of wind and water, how to see the true nature of any living thing. But most importantly, she knew who she was. Through the mate bond, she felt Damon's sword find its mark, felt his exhausted relief as the battle finally ended. His survival flooded her with such profound joy that silver light erupted from her skin, illuminating the entire clearing. "You are ready," the ancestral voice murmured, fainter now but filled with pride. "The daughter of the moon has awakened at last." But even as power sang through her blood, Kira felt the shadow creatures stirring at the edge of the forest, no longer content to wait. They had sensed her transformation, and their hunger had grown to match her strength. The hunt was far from over. It had only just begun. The war drums echoed across the northern border like the heartbeat of some massive, dying beast. Damon stood on the ridge overlooking the Shadowmere Valley, watching smoke rise from 3 burning villages simultaneously. The Northern Shadow Pack had coordinated their attack with military precision, striking at dawn when his forces were spread thin across patrol routes. Kira felt every emotion that coursed through him as if it were her own. The mate bond had grown stronger since her awakening, no longer a whisper, but a constant presence in her consciousness. She pressed her hands against her chest, trying to ease the ache that came from being separated from him during battle, but the connection only intensified. Through his eyes, she saw the enemy forces pouring over the ridgeline like a black tide. Wolves the size of horses, with eyes like burning coals, their forms too large and too wrong to be natural. Behind them came their human handlers, faces painted with symbols that hurt to look at directly, wielding weapons that gleamed with unnatural light. "Marcus, take the western flank!" Damon's voice carried across the battlefield with the authority of absolute command. "Elena, your archers to the high ground. We hold them at the river, or we lose everything." Kira felt his strategic mind working, calculating angles and distances and acceptable losses. But underneath the tactical thinking, she sensed his deeper fear, not for himself, but for her. Even in the midst of coordinating a desperate defence, part of his consciousness reached toward her through the bond, checking, worrying, needing to know she was safe. The first clash came with the sound of metal on claw and the screams of the wounded. Damon's sword sang as it cut through Shadow Wolf hide, but for every enemy that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. The Northern Pack fought with the desperate hunger of creatures that had been starved too long, their attacks wild but devastatingly effective. Kira gasped as pain lanced through her shoulder, Damon's pain, as claws raked across his armour. She felt his blood running warm down his arm, felt the jarring impact as he rolled away from snapping jaws that would have torn his throat out. But worse than the physical pain was what she sensed beneath it. These weren't ordinary wolves driven by territory disputes or pack politics. Something else controlled them, something that whispered in the spaces between thoughts and promised power in exchange for obedience, the same darkness she had felt from the shadow creatures that had hunted her. "They're connected," she whispered to the empty shrine, her revelation echoing off ancient stones. "The attacks on me, the Northern War, it's all the same enemy." As if responding to her understanding, the battle intensified. Through Damon's senses, she felt him calling on reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed, his wolf form erupting in a display of alpha dominance that sent smaller enemies fleeing. But there were too many of them, and his forces were being pushed back toward the river. That was when she felt him preparing to make the ultimate sacrifice. The plan formed in his mind with crystalline clarity, a last desperate gambit to buy time for his pack to retreat. He would charge the enemy centre alone, drawing their attention while his people escaped across the water. No. The word tore from her throat with such force that silver light exploded from her skin, illuminating the shrine clearing like a second sun. Every bird in the forest took flight, and somewhere in the distance she heard wolves howling in response to power they could sense but not understand. The light kept building, fed by her desperate love and absolute refusal to let him die alone. She poured everything she had learned from the trials into that illumination, all her newfound understanding of what her power was meant to protect. The bond between them became a conduit, and through it she sent every ounce of strength she possessed racing across the miles to find him. On the battlefield, Damon staggered as lunar power flooded through him like liquid fire. His wounds began to heal, his exhaustion fell away, and when he raised his sword again, it blazed with silver light that made the enemy forces recoil in terror. But Kira's power didn't stop with him. It flowed outward through the pack bonds that connected every wolf in his forces, strengthening them, healing them, wrapping them in protective barriers of moonlight that turned shadow wolf claws aside like they were striking solid stone. The tide of battle turned in an instant. Northern forces that had been pressing their advantage suddenly found themselves facing opponents who fought with supernatural strength and coordination. The shadow wolves began to retreat, their handlers screaming orders that were no longer obeyed. Through the bond, Kira felt Damon's amazement and fierce pride as he realized what was happening. She was fighting beside him despite being miles away, her power flowing through their connection to protect everything he held dear. But the effort was costing her. She felt her strength draining like water through a broken dam, her vision beginning to blur as she pushed her newly awakened abilities beyond their limits. The silver light flickering around her began to fade. That was when she noticed them, pack members she had never suspected, wolves who had fought beside Damon for years, suddenly stepping back from the protective aura her power had created. Their eyes held a different kind of fear now, not the healthy respect of those witnessing something greater than themselves, but the cold calculation of those who realized their carefully laid plans were crumbling. Through their expressions, she saw the truth. Some of Damon's own people had been working with the enemy, feeding information about patrol routes and defensive positions. Her power surge had revealed them by showing who welcomed her protection and who recoiled from it. The revelation hit Damon at the same moment, the bond carrying her understanding to him in a flash of shared knowledge. She felt his rage and betrayal, saw him memorizing faces and filing away information for later justice. But the immediate battle was won. The northern forces were retreating, their supernatural coordination broken, their shadow wolf allies fleeing back toward whatever darkness had spawned them. The villages would be rebuilt, the dead would be mourned, and the survivors would have time to prepare for whatever came next. Kira collapsed beside the altar, her power spent, her body trembling with exhaustion. But through the bond, she felt Damon's relief and love washing over her like warm sunlight, and she knew the sacrifice had been worth it. The war was far from over, but they had bought precious time. And now they knew their true enemies weren't just attacking from outside their borders. Some of them had been inside all along, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As consciousness faded, Kira's last thought was a warning she hoped would reach him through their connection. The betrayers had seen what she could do now. They would not wait long before trying to eliminate her permanently. Isabella's smile was beautiful and terrible as she watched the last loyal guard fall to his knees in the compound courtyard, foam speckling his lips where the poisoned water had done its work. 3 days had passed since Damon's forces returned victorious but depleted from the northern border, and he had departed again within hours to pursue the retreating enemy. The perfect opportunity. "Clean this up," she ordered the remaining guards, the ones who had chosen survival over loyalty when she revealed her true allegiances. "Make it look like he died in his sleep, natural causes." Kira watched from the shadows of the servants' quarters, her newly awakened senses allowing her to see through the illusion magic Isabella wore like a second skin. Beneath the facade of grieving bride-to-be, something else moved. Something that whispered in languages older than human speech and hungered for royal blood. The water poisoning had been subtle, almost impossible to detect. A compound that suppressed supernatural abilities while slowly killing those who possessed them. Isabella had been dosing the supply for weeks, targeting anyone who might stand in her way when the time came to act. Kira pressed herself deeper into the shadows, fighting the urge to confront Isabella directly. She was still exhausted from channeling power across the miles to protect Damon's forces, her abilities flickering unpredictably. A direct confrontation now would be suicide. Through the mate bond, she felt Damon's distant presence like a candle flame in darkness. He was tracking the northern forces deeper into enemy territory, following a trail that Isabella had undoubtedly helped arrange. Every mile he travelled took him further from his people, further from her. "Phase 2, Isabella murmured to the corrupted guards. "Bring me the kitchen staff who refused to cooperate. It's time they understood the consequences of misplaced loyalty." Kira's blood turned to ice as she realised what Isabella intended. The servants who had shown her kindness, who had protected her from earlier assassination attempts, were about to pay the ultimate price for their compassion. She slipped through the compound like a ghost, using skills she hadn't known she possessed. The awakening had changed more than just her magical abilities. Her movements were quieter, her reflexes faster, her awareness of her surroundings heightened to supernatural levels. In the lower levels of the compound, she found them: Cook Eleanor, 2 scullery maids, and old Henrik, who tended the fires. All bound and gagged, terror bright in their eyes, as Isabella's followers prepared dark ritual implements around them. "The Moon Empress bloodline ends tonight," Isabella was saying, her voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself feel poisoned. "But first, we send a message to our absent Alpha about the cost of choosing the wrong mate." The ritual blade in her hand gleamed with unnatural light, its edge inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Shadow Court magic, designed to not just kill, but to trap souls in eternal torment. Kira stepped from the shadows, lunar power beginning to build around her despite her exhaustion. "Let them go, Isabella. Your quarrel is with me." Isabella spun around, her beautiful mask finally slipping to reveal the thing wearing her face. Her eyes had gone completely black, and when she smiled, her teeth were too sharp, too many. "How considerate of you to save me the trouble of hunting you down," Isabella purred, but the voice carried undertones of something vast and hungry. "Though I confess I was looking forward to making you watch your protectors die first." The corrupted pack members moved to surround Kira, their forms beginning to shift in ways that had nothing to do with natural wolf transformation. Their bones elongated, their joints bent at impossible angles, and darkness leaked from their eyes like tears. "You wondered how we found you so quickly after your awakening," Isabella continued, circling Kira like a predator. "How we knew exactly when and where to strike. The answer is simple, little moon child. We've been here all along." She gestured to the transformed pack members, and Kira realised with horror that some of these faces belonged to wolves who had served Damon's family for generations. The corruption ran deeper than she had imagined. "The Shadow Court doesn't just hunt royal bloodlines," Isabella explained with false patience. "We cultivate them, we guide them, we ensure they grow strong enough to serve our purposes before we harvest what we need." The ritual implements around the bound servants began to glow, fed by the ambient fear and despair in the room. Kira felt her power responding, trying to build to the explosive levels she had reached during the battle. But something was wrong. The energy felt sluggish, contaminated. "Oh yes, I know about your little power surge," Isabella laughed. "Quite impressive, really, but you've been breathing our poisoned air, drinking our tainted water, eating our corrupted food for days now. Your abilities are compromised." Kira staggered as the truth hit her. The suppression compound hadn't been intended to kill her quickly. It was meant to weaken her gradually, to ensure that when this moment came, she would be helpless. "The mating ceremony is in 2 days," Isabella continued, beginning to trace symbols in the air with the ritual blade. "When Damon returns to find you dead and his loyal servants tortured, he'll be broken, desperate, vulnerable, and I'll be there to comfort him, to guide him, to help him channel his grief into rage against our enemies." The air around Isabella began to thicken with shadow magic, and Kira felt her weakened power struggling against forces far beyond her current ability to handle. The Shadow Court entity wearing Isabella's form was ancient, experienced, and had been planning this moment for far longer than Kira had been alive. But as the ritual blade rose toward old Henrik's throat, something inside Kira snapped. Not her power, which remained frustratingly weak, but something deeper. Something that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with love. She lunged forward, not with supernatural speed, but with desperate human determination, tackling Isabella before the blade could fall. They crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs and fury, the ritual knife skittering across the stone. "You want to hurt the people I care about?" Kira snarled, her hands finding Isabella's throat. "You'll have to go through me first." Isabella's form began to shift and flow, becoming something that was no longer entirely human. But Kira held on, using every ounce of strength she possessed to keep the creature from completing its ritual. Around them, the corrupted pack members closed in, ready to tear her apart. The bound servants watched in terror as two supernatural forces struggled for dominance in the heart of their home. And somewhere in the distance, carried on winds that tasted of battle and blood, Kira thought she heard the sound of wolves howling. Damon was coming home. The truth hit Kira like a physical blow as Oracle Marjorie's words echoed through the shrine chamber where they had taken refuge after escaping Isabella's trap. The old woman's eyes held depths of knowledge that seemed to span centuries, and what she revealed made the scope of their enemy clearer and more terrifying than Kira had ever imagined. "The Shadow Court has been hunting your bloodline for over 300 years, Marjorie said, her weathered hands tracing protective symbols in the dirt around them. "They are not wolves, child. They are not even mortal. They are beings of pure darkness who were banished to the void by the original Moon Empress, and they have spent every moment since then plotting their return." Kira pressed her back against the ancient altar stone, feeling its solid presence as an anchor in a world that suddenly made no sense. Around them, the bound servants they had rescued huddled together, their eyes wide with terror at revelations that challenged everything they thought they knew about their world. "The Northern Shadow Pack," she whispered, pieces of a horrific puzzle finally beginning to fit together. "They're not really a pack at all, are they?" "Thralls," Marjorie confirmed grimly. "Wolves whose minds have been consumed by Shadow Court influence. They retain their physical forms, but their souls belong to the darkness now. Every attack, every strategy, every moment of this war has been orchestrated by immortal beings who view mortal life as nothing more than pieces on a game board." Through the mate bond, Kira felt Damon's distant exhaustion as he pursued enemies who always seemed to stay one step ahead of his forces. Now she understood why. The Shadow Court could see through the eyes of their thralls, could coordinate attacks across vast distances, could manipulate events with the patience of creatures who measured time in centuries rather than days. "But why?" Cook Elena asked from where she sat tending Henrik's wounds. "What do they want with us?" Marjorie's expression grew even more grave. "Revenge and freedom. The original binding ritual that banished them required the willing sacrifice of the Moon Empress's own life force. It created a prison keyed specifically to royal blood. Only a living descendant of that bloodline can either strengthen the bonds that hold them or break them entirely." The implication crashed over Kira like a cold wave. "They don't just want to kill me, they want to use me." "Your blood, freely given through ritual sacrifice, would shatter the barriers between their void prison and our world," Marjorie confirmed. "They would be free to consume everything, to transform this realm into an extension of their darkness. But if you were to die naturally or in simple combat, the binding would hold for another generation." "That's why Isabella didn't just murder me in my sleep," Kira realised. "She needed me alive for the ritual, conscious and aware when they—" She couldn't finish the thought. Marjorie nodded grimly. "The Shadow Court feeds on despair as much as blood. Your terror and hopelessness would make the ritual more powerful, would give them greater strength when they finally break free." Around them, the shrine's protective wards hummed with ancient power, but even those felt fragile against the scope of what they were facing. Kira could sense things moving in the darkness beyond the sacred grove, probing for weaknesses, testing the limits of the sanctuary. "There's more," Marjorie continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Isabella is not the only vessel they have corrupted. The Shadow Court has been placing their agents in positions of power throughout the supernatural world for decades. Pack leaders, oracle guides, even some of the oldest families have members who serve the darkness." The betrayal ran deeper than Kira had imagined. Not just Isabella, not just a few corrupted pack members, but a vast network of infiltrators working toward a single goal: the systematic elimination of her bloodline and the freedom of entities that should never be allowed to touch their world. "How many?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Unknown. The Shadow Court is patient and subtle. They corrupt through promises of power, through threats against loved ones, through slow psychological manipulation that can take years to complete. Some of their agents may not even realize what they truly serve." Through the bond, Kira felt a spike of alarm from Damon. Something was happening on the northern front, something that made his warrior's instincts scream danger. But the connection was too distant, too fragmented for her to understand what he was facing. "We have to warn him," she said, rising from where she sat. "If there are Shadow Court agents in his forces—" "Child, sit down." Marjorie's voice carried compelling force. "Your mate is beyond our reach for now. The Shadow Court's influence grows stronger as night falls, and the only safe place for you is here, within the shrine's protection." But even as she spoke, the wards around them began to flicker. Something was testing their strength, pushing against the barriers with relentless pressure. Shadows moved wrong among the trees, flowing upward instead of falling, reaching toward them with fingers made of living darkness. "They found us," Elena whispered, clutching Henrik's hand. Kira felt her weakened power stirring in response to the threat, but it felt like trying to light a candle in a hurricane. The suppression compounds Isabella had been feeding her were still in her system, limiting her abilities when she needed them most. "The Shadow Court grows stronger as the binding weakens," Marjorie explained, her own power beginning to glow around her fingers. "Every year that passes without a Moon Empress to renew the prison makes them more capable of reaching into our world. That's why they've been able to corrupt so many, why their influence spreads like poison." Outside the shrine's protection, something howled, not with the voice of any natural wolf, but with harmonics that spoke of endless hunger and hate. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding them. "How do I stop them?" Kira asked desperately. "How do I fight something like this?" Marjorie met her eyes with a gaze that held centuries of accumulated wisdom and sorrow. "You become what you were born to be, child. You claim your full inheritance and remake the binding stronger than ever before. But the cost—" she shook her head. "The cost may be everything you think you want from this life." The shadows pressed closer to the shrine's barriers, and Kira could see forms moving within them. Not just the shadow creatures she had faced before, but larger things, ancient things that had been waiting in the void for their chance at revenge. The final battle was coming, whether she was ready or not, and somewhere in the distance she felt Damon's shock and horror through their bond as he finally understood the true nature of the enemies he had been chasing. Some truths were too terrible to face alone. The ancient prophecy was carved into stone so old that even Oracle Marjorie had to trace the symbols with her fingers to read them, her voice trembling as she spoke words that had waited centuries to be fulfilled. The shrine walls seemed to pulse with each syllable, responding to magic that predated human civilization. "When the moon turns to blood and shadow devours light, the daughter of the silver line shall stand at the crossroads of all worlds," Marjorie read, her weathered face grave in the flickering candlelight. "In 7 turnings of the sun she must claim her throne, or watch all thrones fall to darkness, eternal." Kira felt the words settle into her bones like a weight she would carry until her last breath. 7 days. The lunar eclipse that would peak in exactly 1 week would be unlike any celestial event in recorded history. The prophecy spoke of cosmic forces aligning in ways that happened perhaps once in 1,000 years. "What does it mean?" she asked, though part of her already understood. The growing pressure she felt in the air, the way shadows moved wrong even in daylight, the constant sense that reality itself was becoming unstable. "The eclipse will amplify all supernatural abilities 100-fold, Marjorie explained, closing the ancient tome with reverent care. "For those with light-based powers like yours, it represents the chance to achieve strength beyond anything your ancestors possessed. But for beings of darkness," she gestured toward the shadows pressing against their sanctuary, "it will give them enough power to shatter any prison, break any binding, cross any barrier between worlds." Through the mate bond, Kira felt Damon's sudden spike of alarm, followed by the familiar sensation of him pushing his horse harder than was wise. He was racing back from the northern front, abandoning the pursuit that had drawn him away. Somehow he had sensed the cosmic countdown beginning. "See, 7 days to fully awaken my powers," Kira said, testing the words, "or the Shadow Court breaks free and destroys everything." "Not destroys," Marjorie corrected grimly. "Consumes. They don't seek to rule over empty ruins. They want to transform this entire realm into an extension of their void, to make every living thing a source of suffering for their eternal hunger." The scope of what was at stake made Kira's head swim. Not just her pack, not just her people, but every creature that drew breath under sun and moon. The responsibility felt crushing, impossible for someone who had spent most of her life believing she was worth nothing. But as the weight of destiny pressed down on her, she felt something else stirring. The power that had manifested during Damon's battle, the strength that had allowed her to face the trials and emerge transformed. It was still there, still growing despite the suppression compounds in her system. "How do I do it?" she asked. "How do I awaken fully in time?" Marjorie's expression grew even more serious. "The same way your ancestor did, child, through sacrifice, struggle, and absolute commitment to protecting what you love. But the awakening process is dangerous. Push too hard, too fast, and your mortal form may not survive the transformation." Outside their sanctuary, something roared, not the voice of any earthly predator, but the sound of cosmic hunger given throat. The shrine's protective barriers flickered, and for a moment Kira caught a glimpse of what waited beyond them. Creatures of living shadow the size of buildings, their forms shifting and flowing like nightmares made manifest. "They grow bolder," Marjorie observed. "The eclipse's approach gives them strength to test our defences directly." As if summoned by her words, the forest around them began to change. Trees that had stood for centuries started to wither, their leaves turning black and falling like tears. Animals fled in every direction, instinctively understanding that something fundamentally wrong was happening to their world. Through the mate bond, Kira felt Damon's horse stumble and nearly fall as supernatural wrongness swept across the land in visible waves. He was still days away from reaching them, pushing his mount beyond endurance, but unable to move faster than the darkness spreading outward from the Shadow Court's growing influence. "I can't wait for him," she realised aloud. "The awakening has to begin now, or there won't be anything left for him to come home to." Marjorie nodded sadly. "The trials you faced before were merely preparation. True awakening requires you to face the deepest parts of yourself, to accept not just power, but the absolute responsibility that comes with it. Many who attempt the full transformation are destroyed by what they discover about themselves." Kira thought about Isabella's words in the compound dungeons, about how the Shadow Court had been cultivating royal bloodlines for generations. What if there was darkness in her heritage? What if the power she was meant to claim came with corruption she couldn't resist? "What if I become something terrible?" she whispered. "Then you will be a terrible thing that protects the innocent rather than devours them," Marjorie replied without hesitation. "Power itself is neutral, child. What matters is the heart that wields it." The oracle began preparing ritual implements around the central altar. her movements precise despite her obvious fear. Crystals that hummed with stored moonlight, herbs that had been blessed under 13 different full moons, silver chains that would help anchor Kira's spirit to the mortal realm during the transformation. "The process will take 3 days," Marjorie explained. 3 days of pushing your consciousness beyond normal human limits, of channeling forces that were never meant to flow through mortal flesh. If you survive, you will emerge with the full power of the Moon Empress bloodline. If you fail—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Failure meant death, and with Kira's death, the last hope of stopping the Shadow Court died as well. Through the bond, she felt Damon's desperation as he sensed her fear and determination. He was trying to reach her through their connection, trying to send strength and comfort across the miles that separated them. But she could also feel his own terror at what she was about to attempt. "He's afraid I won't survive," she said. "He should be," Marjorie replied bluntly. "But he should be more afraid of what happens if you don't try." Around them, the shrine's protective wards began to sing, responding to the ritual preparations. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, like voices of angels mixed with the howl of winter wind. But underneath that beauty was something else, a harmonic that spoke of endings and beginnings, of the price that must always be paid for transformation. Kira placed her hands on the altar stone, feeling its ancient power flow into her bones. Through the mate bond, she sent Damon everything she couldn't say aloud. Her love for him, her determination to protect their future, her promise that she would fight with everything she had to return to his arms. "Begin," she said, her voice steady despite the terror and hope warring in her chest. The lunar awakening ritual began with silver light erupting from every crystal in the chamber, and somewhere in the distance, the Shadow Court entities howled their rage at the power building against them. 7 days to save the world. The countdown had begun. The second day of the awakening ritual brought horrors that defied comprehension. Kira hung suspended between worlds, her consciousness stretched thin as cosmic forces flowed through her mortal form, when the first Shadow Court entity tore through the shrine's protective barriers like they were made of gossamer threads. The creature that emerged from the rift between dimensions stood 12 feet tall and cast no shadow despite being made entirely of living darkness. Where its feet touched the sacred ground, the ancient stones began to crack and weep, a substance that looked disturbingly like blood. Its voice, when it spoke, came from everywhere at once. "The awakening ends here, daughter of the Silver Line." Oracle Marjorie threw herself between the entity and Kira's vulnerable form, her aged hands blazing with protective magic that had taken decades to master. But the power that had once seemed formidable now looked pitifully small against something that had existed since before the first stars learned to burn. "You cannot have her," Marjorie snarled, pouring everything she had into barriers of golden light. "The sanctuary is sacred, inviolate." The Shadow Court entity laughed, a sound like civilization's dying. "Your sanctuary was built with our permission, old woman. We allowed the Moon Empress to think she had found safety while we prepared our final move. Every stone, every ward, every protection you trusted was designed to fail at this moment." The revelation hit like a physical blow. The shrine that had seemed like humanity's last bastion had been a trap all along, designed to draw Kira to the perfect location for the Shadow Court's ultimate ritual. They had been playing a game that spanned centuries, and she had walked willingly into their endgame. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Kira felt something else stirring. The awakening process had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Her consciousness existed in multiple layers now, part of her still anchored to her physical form, while other aspects ranged across dimensions she had never known existed. Through those expanded senses, she perceived the truth. The Shadow Court entity wasn't lying about the shrine's original design, but it wasn't telling the complete truth either. The sanctuary had been built as a trap, but it was a trap that cut both ways. "You're not at full strength either," she realized, her voice echoing strangely through the ritual space. "The eclipse hasn't peaked yet. You can manifest physically, but you're still bound by the original prison, still limited." The entity's form rippled with what might have been annoyance. "Clever child, but limitation is relative when facing mortals." It moved faster than thought, crossing the distance between them in an instant. Oracle Marjorie's barriers shattered like glass, and the old woman was flung against the far wall with enough force to crack stone. She slumped to the ground and didn't rise again. Kira tried to move, to defend herself, but her body was locked in the awakening trance. Only her expanding consciousness could act, and she was still learning how to wield power on planes beyond the physical. The entity reached toward her with appendages that weren't quite arms, and where they touched her skin, frost spread like infection. That was when the second entity emerged. Isabella stepped through another dimensional rift, but the thing wearing her face bore no resemblance to the pack member who had once served as Damon's intended mate. Her form shifted constantly, beautiful one moment and horrifying the next, as if the Shadow Court's corruption couldn't decide what shape would be most effective. "The vessel served its purpose," the Isabella thing said, its voice a harmony of whispers, but direct action was always the preferred solution. Around the shrine, reality began to warp. Trees that had stood for centuries aged decades in seconds before crumbling to dust. The sky above took on colours that had no names, and stars became visible in broad daylight, burning with cold fire that offered no warmth. Through the mate bond, Kira felt Damon's shock and horror as the supernatural wrongness reached his location. He was close now, perhaps only hours away, but what he would find when he arrived might be a world already transformed into something unrecognizable. The first entity pressed its assault, and Kira felt her life force being drawn out like thread from a spindle. But the awakening process had taught her something about the nature of power itself. It didn't flow in only one direction. She reached out with senses she hadn't possessed days earlier and touched the entity's essence directly. What she found there surprised her. Beneath the cosmic malevolence and ancient hunger lay something she recognized: pain, loneliness, the desperate isolation of beings who had been cut off from the natural order for so long they had forgotten what connection felt like. "You're not evil," she whispered, her realization rippling through dimensions. "You're broken." The entity recoiled, as if she had struck it with physical force. "Do not presume to understand us, mortal child. We are beyond your concepts of good and evil, beyond your need for connection," Kira finished. "You've been alone in the void for centuries. You've forgotten what it feels like to be part of something larger than yourselves." The Isabella thing hissed, its form becoming more monstrous. "Silence her. She sees too much." But Kira's awakening consciousness was expanding faster now, fed by understanding rather than just raw power. She could perceive the network of pain that connected all the Shadow Court entities, the way their exile had twisted them into beings who could only relate to others through domination and consumption. "I can feel it," she said, her voice growing stronger despite the life force being drained from her physical form. "The emptiness where your connection to the natural order used to be, the wound that never healed after the banishment." The first entity's assault faltered. For just a moment, something like recognition flickered in the void where its face should have been. That moment of hesitation was all Oracle Marjorie needed. The old woman hadn't been unconscious, merely gathering her strength for one final act. She rose from where she had fallen, her form blazing with magic that consumed her life force as fuel, and spoke words in the first language, the tongue that had shaped reality when the world was young. The binding ritual that had held the Shadow Court for centuries activated with the force of a cosmic thunderclap. Every entity that had manifested physically was suddenly wreathed in chains of silver fire, their forms beginning to blur as the prison reasserted its hold. "You cannot!" the Isabella thing shrieked. "The eclipse comes, our time of freedom—" "Is not yet," Marjorie gasped, her body beginning to crumble as she poured her remaining life into the spell. "The awakening continues. The daughter of the silver line will choose her own fate, not have it chosen for her." The entities were pulled back toward their dimensional prison, but their final words echoed through the collapsing shrine with the weight of absolute certainty. "We return when the moon bleeds, child, and next time nothing will hold us back." The shrine walls cracked and began to fall, but Kira's awakening process continued undeterred. If anything, the confrontation had accelerated her transformation, burning away the last of her doubts about what she was meant to become. Oracle Marjorie smiled as her form dissolved into points of light that merged with the ritual energies surrounding Kira. "Finish what we started," her voice whispered from everywhere at once. "Save them all." In the distance, Kira felt Damon's presence racing toward her, his wolf form pushing beyond all physical limits. He would arrive to find the shrine in ruins, but he would also find her transformed beyond anything either of them had imagined possible. The final phase of her awakening was about to begin. The lunar eclipse began with blood. Kira felt the first shadow touch the moon's surface like a blade across her soul, the connection between her awakening power and the celestial body so profound that every change in the lunar light sent shockwaves through her transforming consciousness. Around the ruins of the shrine, reality itself began to buckle as cosmic forces built toward their inevitable collision. Damon arrived as the sky turned the colour of old copper, his wolf form bursting through the tree line with desperate fury. He shifted to human shape while still running, his eyes taking in the destroyed sanctuary, Oracle Marjorie's absence, and Kira suspended in silver fire at the centre of what had once been the sacred altar. "What have they done to you?" he breathed, reaching toward her before supernatural energy crackled a warning between them. "Don't touch me," Kira gasped, her voice echoing with harmonics that spoke of power barely contained within mortal flesh. "The awakening is at the critical phase. Any interruption could kill us both." But even as she warned him away, she felt their mate bond strengthen and deepen, fed by the eclipse's amplification of all supernatural connections. Through that link, she shared everything she had learned about the Shadow Court, about the cosmic trap they had walked into, about the choice that would determine the fate of every living thing. Damon's face went white as the full scope of their situation hit him. "How long do we have?" "Until totality," she whispered, gesturing toward the moon that was now half consumed by shadow. "When the eclipse reaches its peak, either I complete the transformation and gain the power to renew the binding, or the Shadow Court breaks free permanently." That was when the first of the entities returned. They poured through dimensional rifts that opened like wounds in the air, their forms more solid and terrible than they had been during the failed assault on the shrine. The eclipse was feeding them power in geometric progression, and what had been barely manifested shadows were now creatures of nightmare given flesh and fury. The Isabella thing led them, her corrupted form now towering 15 feet tall, her beautiful face split by a mouthful of teeth like broken obsidian. Behind her came dozens of Shadow Court entities, each one unique in its horror, each one radiating malevolence that made the air itself feel poisonous. "The moon bleeds, and we are free," Isabella declared, her voice shaking the ground. "The final binding ends tonight." Damon stepped between the approaching entities and Kira's vulnerable form, his wolf bursting through his human shape in an explosion of protective fury. But this wasn't the controlled shift of an alpha asserting dominance. This was something primal and desperate, his beast responding to the mate bond's demand that he defend what he loved regardless of the cost. "You want her?" he snarled, his wolf form crackling with energy borrowed from Kira's awakening power. "You go through me first." The battle that followed defied every natural law. Damon fought with strength that shouldn't have been possible. the mate bond allowing him to channel fragments of Kira's growing power even as she struggled to maintain control of the transformation process. His claws left trails of silver fire that burned through shadow-caught flesh like acid, and when the entity's attacks found their mark, lunar energy flowed through the bond to heal his wounds almost instantly. But there were too many of them, and they were growing stronger with each moment the eclipse progressed. Kira felt her concentration fracturing as she tried to complete the awakening ritual while simultaneously feeding power to Damon through their connection. The cosmic forces flowing through her mortal form were reaching the breaking point, and she could feel her physical body beginning to burn away under the strain. "I can't hold it," she gasped, silver light beginning to leak from her eyes and mouth. "The power is too much." That was when she felt every wolf in the surrounding territory, their pack bonds suddenly blazing to life as her expanding consciousness touched theirs. They were responding to her awakening not as individuals, but as a collective, their combined strength flowing toward her like tributaries joining a great river. Even the corrupted pack members who had served Isabella felt the call. The Shadow Court's influence over them wavered as something deeper and more fundamental asserted itself. They were wolves first, dark servants second, and the Moon Empress bloodline spoke to parts of their souls that no corruption could entirely destroy. "She is our Alpha," they whispered in unison, their voices carrying across miles. "She is our light in the darkness." The power that flowed into Kira through 100 pack bonds was different from the cosmic forces of her royal awakening. This was pack magic, community magic, the strength that came from being part of something larger than oneself. It anchored her transformation, gave her mortal form the foundation it needed to channel divine power without being consumed. Isabella shrieked as she realized what was happening. "They belong to us. We marked them, claimed them, shaped them to our will." "You shaped their minds," Kira said, her voice now carrying the authority of absolute power. "But you never touched their hearts." The awakening reached its crescendo as the eclipse achieved totality, and Kira felt the final barriers between her mortal consciousness and her cosmic inheritance dissolve. Power beyond imagining flooded through her, turning her physical form into a beacon of silver fire that could be seen for hundreds of miles. She stood, no longer bound by the ritual circle, no longer vulnerable to interruption. Around her, reality bent to accommodate forces that had been building for centuries. The destroyed shrine rebuilt itself in seconds, its stones singing with renewed power. The withered trees burst into bloom, their leaves shining like captured starlight. But most importantly, she could see the Shadow Court entities for what they truly were. Not cosmic evils beyond redemption, but broken children of creation who had been cut off from the natural order so long they had forgotten how to exist without causing pain. "I offer you a choice," she said, her words carrying across dimensions. "Return to the void willingly, and I will craft you a new prison that includes connection to the life you've been missing. Continue to fight, and I will bind you in isolation so complete that this exile will seem like paradise." Some of the entities actually hesitated, ancient hunger warring with an even more ancient loneliness. But Isabella would accept no mercy. "We do not negotiate with mortals." She launched herself at Kira with all the fury of centuries of imprisonment, her corrupted form blazing with shadow fire that promised absolute destruction. Kira met her attack with moonlight that sang of love and sacrifice and the fierce protection of all living things. Where the two forces collided, the air itself burned, and the fabric of reality strained to contain their conflict. The battle for the world's soul had begun.